In the autumn of 1964, the British Special Air Service stood at a crossroads. The regiment had proven itself time and again in counterinsurgency campaigns across the globe, from Malaya to Borneo to Aden. But as the Cold War deepened and international tensions flared across Southeast Asia, the SAS found themselves drawn into a new kind of conflict, one where their unconventional tactics would be tested not just against enemy soldiers, but against the constraints imposed by their American allies. The question was not whether they could accomplish their mission. The question was whether they could accomplish it in exactly 60 minutes of air support, and what it meant for the future of their regiment if they could. The theater was Indonesia, a nation still volatile in the aftermath of its independence and colonial wars. Indonesia's President Sukarno had begun moving closer to communist elements within his government, and neighboring Malaysia faced the very real threat of Indonesian-backed insurgents crossing the border in Borneo. The British, still maintaining colonial and Commonwealth interests in the region, saw the threat as urgent. They needed to strike deep into Indonesian territory to disrupt insurgent supply lines, dismantle training camps, and demonstrate that Malaysia was not an easy target. The SAS, as the tip of the spear in unconventional warfare, was tasked with planning an operation that would be audacious, precise, and, in the eyes of the American military advisors, coordinating the broader regional strategy, necessarily brief. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. If you haven't already, make sure you hit the subscribe button to not miss any story. And check out our Patreon in the description. We post full uncensored stories there. Every graphic detail, every brutal moment, nothing redacted. Stories YouTube won't allow. Now let's get into it. The operation that would come to be known as Operation Trent began not with a bang, but with a negotiation. The SAS planners, led by officers who had studied the terrain of Borneo with meticulous detail, presented their proposal to American commanders in Kuala Lumpur and to their own superiors in London. They wanted to conduct a raid deep into Kalimantan, the Indonesian portion of Borneo, targeting a reported training facility that was churning out cadres of Indonesian regular army soldiers and communist-aligned fighters. The target was substantial enough to warrant a major operation, but the location, remote, densely forested, accessible only by river or on foot, meant that any raid would be one way in terms of swift exfiltration. The men would go in light, strike hard, and withdraw under cover. The Americans, however, brought a new variable to the equation. They had air assets, jet fighters, transport aircraft, and attack helicopters positioned throughout the region, and they were willing to provide support to British operations as long as those operations aligned with broader American objectives. But air support came with strings attached. Every aircraft in the region was already allocated to multiple contingencies. The Americans were juggling commitments across Vietnam, Thailand, and Malaysia simultaneously. They could not simply hand over 24 hours of continuous air coverage to a single British operation. What they could offer, and what they made clear was the limit of their commitment, was 1 hour of continuous tactical air support. For most commanders, this would have been an unacceptable constraint. 1 hour was the span of a single bombing run, a brief show of force. It was not enough time to establish air superiority, suppress multiple enemy positions, or provide sustained cover for a withdrawal. But the SAS officers looked at the problem differently. They began asking not what 1 hour of air support could do for a poorly planned operation, but what a perfectly planned operation could accomplish within 1 hour of air support. This reframing was subtle but crucial. It meant they had to compress every element of their tactical planning into a single, devastating window. The planning that followed was nothing short of obsessive. The SAS intelligence officers gathered every scrap of information about the target. They interviewed patrols that had conducted reconnaissance across the border. They studied maps with a level of detail that bordered on archaeological, marking footpaths, river crossings, weapon caches, and supply routes. They consulted with Malaysian soldiers who had grown familiar with the terrain and the enemy's patterns of movement. They built a three-dimensional model of the insertion point and target area, running through insertion and withdrawal routes until every man understood exactly where he was going and what he would do when he got there. The targeting intelligence, according to accounts from operations officers who participated in the planning, described the training facility as a compound of wooden structures scattered across a clearing near a major river tributary. The facility housed a rotating contingent of trainees, sometimes 30, sometimes as many as 80, depending on when in the training cycle the raid was timed. The SAS planners did not simply plan to destroy buildings. They planned to arrive at a moment when the compound would be full, to create maximum disruption and deny the Indonesian military a trained cadre of insurgents for months to come. The intelligence suggested that the best window was during early morning, when soldiers would be assembling for dawn exercises. The operational plan itself was a marvel of compressed complexity. The SAS would insert by helicopter at a location roughly 8 kilometers from the target. They would move through the jungle at night, using the darkness to conceal their approach. They would establish a firm base a few hundred meters from the compound in the pre-dawn hours. At first light, the American aircraft would arrive overhead, fighters equipped with bombs and rockets, along with attack helicopters carrying machine gun fire and more ordnance. The fighters would make their first passes at the moment of insertion, catching whatever enemy forces might be on alert. The helicopters would remain overhead, loitering, ready to provide suppressive fire if the SAS assault team came under heavy fire. This 1 hour of air support would provide the SAS with the window they needed to assault the compound, secure it, search for intelligence materials, and begin their withdrawal. But the SAS knew something that American commanders often overlooked. Air support was only as valuable as it was coordinated with ground forces. They did not plan to sit in their firm base and let the Americans do the work. Instead, they planned to assault the compound simultaneously with the airstrikes, moving in during the chaos and confusion created by the bombing. They would use the Americans not as the primary weapon, but as a force multiplier, something that added velocity and surprise to their own assault. This required precise timing. The airstrikes had to hit at exactly the right moment, not a second early or a second late. The ground assault had to move at exactly the right pace to catch the defending forces in a state of disorganization. To achieve this coordination, a junior SAS officer who would serve as a forward air controller was attached to the assault group. His role was not to direct airstrikes from a distance, but to move with the assault force and use portable radio equipment to call in strikes in real time based on what he saw developing on the ground. According to accounts from veterans of similar operations, this role was among the most dangerous in the raid. The forward air controller had to remain mobile, maintain radio contact with aircraft moving at several hundred miles per hour, and make split-second judgments about where the next strike needed to fall. Mistakes could mean friendly fire casualties. Delays could mean the enemy had time to organize a defense. The Americans, somewhat skeptically, approved the plan. 1 hour seemed impossibly tight, but they had learned by this point in the war in Southeast Asia that the British handled small-scale operations with a level of sophistication that sometimes surprised them. The SAS was not going to request air support unless they had a very good idea of how to use it. The aircraft were allocated. The time window was set. The date was chosen based on latest intelligence about the training facility. Everything else was now a matter of execution. The insertion took place in darkness, with the SAS team lifted by American helicopters to the landing zone deep in Indonesian territory. Sources describe the men moving out of the helicopter with their weapons, ammunition, and minimal supplies, each soldier carrying roughly 60 pounds of gear. There would be no resupply, no evacuation if things went wrong. This was a one-way mission in the operational sense. They would complete the objective or they would find their own way out, using the cover of the jungle and their knowledge of the terrain to evade enemy pursuit. The march toward the objective took the entire night, with the men moving in single file through dense vegetation, navigating by compass and map, maintaining absolute silence. By the time dawn began to break, the assault force was in position. They had established their firm base 800 meters from the compound, with a covering force positioned to intercept any reinforcements from the north. The assault group, approximately 30 men strong, was deployed in a half-circle facing the target. Behind them, in prepared positions, were soldiers equipped with machine guns and mortars, ready to provide covering fire if the assault team came under fire. Every man had checked his weapon twice. Every man knew his role. They waited for the sound of aircraft engines. The American fighters appeared on time. According to reports from both SAS officers and American air crews, the first pass came at precisely the moment planned. The fighters swooped low over the compound, their bombs exploding in the darkness before the sun had fully crested the horizon. The explosions brought structures down, sent smoke rolling across the clearing, and created instant panic among whatever soldiers were in the compound at that moment. The attack helicopters moved in next, their guns raking across buildings and open ground, suppressing any organized defense. The SAS assault team moved the moment the airstrikes began. They did not wait for the smoke to clear or for the Americans to finish their first pass. They surged forward across the open ground toward the compound, firing as they advanced. Their weapons cut down soldiers who were trying to organize resistance in the confusion. Some of the defending forces attempted to fight back, but the combination of airstrikes, machine gun fire from the covering force, and the SAS assault itself was overwhelming. The defenders, caught in the chaos of the initial bombing, never had time to establish a coherent defense. Once inside the compound, the SAS assault team split into smaller units, each with a specific task. One team was tasked with securing the headquarters building where documents and intelligence materials were likely to be stored. Another team was tasked with destroying the training structures and any weapons caches. A third team was positioned to maintain security and watch for counterattack. The forward air controller remained mobile throughout, maintaining radio contact with the aircraft overhead and calling in strikes on enemy positions that were beginning to consolidate beyond the perimeter of the compound. The searching and destruction of the compound happened in the span of minutes. This was not a leisurely operation where the SAS had time to thoroughly catalog every document or systematically demolish every building. They worked at a sprint, grabbing what intelligence materials they could identify, setting demolition charges on key structures, and ensuring that the facility would not be immediately operational when the Americans' air support window closed. The soldiers poured accelerant on ammunition caches and set them ablaze. They rigged the main storage buildings with explosive charges, whether through pre-positioned demolition kits or by improvising with grenades and plastic explosives. Sources described the destruction as systematic and swift. As the assault team worked, the American aircraft continued their support. The fighters, according to the flight logs of the aircraft involved, expended their ordnance across the broader area around the compound, striking at suspected enemy positions and possible reinforcement routes. The attack helicopters loitered overhead, their guns ready to suppress any organized counterattack. The pilots, watching through their weapon sight systems, reported seeing SAS soldiers moving methodically through the compound even as explosions continued around them. The Americans were struck by how quickly the SAS team seemed to work, how little time they wasted, and how precisely they had planned every minute of the operation. At 25 minutes into the operation, the forward air controller began receiving reports that enemy forces were attempting to organize counterattack positions to the south and east of the compound. The Americans responded by shifting their airstrikes to these positions, bombing and strafing suspected assembly areas. This provided the critical protective shell that allowed the SAS assault team to extend their time inside the compound. Without this American air support, the raid would have had to conclude within minutes. With it, the SAS team could afford to spend an extra 10 or 15 minutes ensuring that the primary intelligence materials had been gathered and the facility was thoroughly destroyed. By the 40-minute mark, the assault team had completed their primary objectives. The headquarters building had been thoroughly searched with documents stuffed into rucksacks. The training facilities had been demolished or set ablaze. The weapons caches had been destroyed. The SAS commander, consulted by radio by the forward air controller, made the decision to withdraw. The operation had achieved everything it set out to accomplish. Pushing further would increase the risk of enemy reinforcement arriving in strength and potentially overrunning the withdrawal route. The withdrawal was as carefully choreographed as the assault. The assault team fell back from the compound in bounds, with covering fire being provided by the security force and the American aircraft. The covering force tracked the enemy positions that were building up around the perimeter, using American airstrikes to keep them at bay. The American helicopters, which had been orbiting overhead, began moving into position to provide pickup for the SAS team at a designated extraction point 5 kilometers from the compound. The difficulty was that the SAS had to move on foot to the extraction point. They could not simply stay at the compound and wait for helicopters. The enemy, even though they had been shocked and disorganized by the initial assault and airstrikes, would eventually attempt to surround and cut off the SAS force if given time. The team therefore moved with purpose. The assault soldiers linked up with the covering force and the security elements, and the entire group began making their way through the jungle toward the extraction point. The march took 30 minutes, moving as quickly as they could while maintaining proper tactical security and accounting for their wounded. There were casualties, though according to accounts they were manageable and did not prevent the operation from continuing. The hour of air support was ending. The American aircraft, having expended their ammunition and fuel, were returning to base. The last jets made a final pass over the withdrawal route, firing at reported enemy positions that were becoming more active as the shock of the initial assault wore off. The attack helicopters made several strafing runs to suppress enemy movement. Then, as suddenly as they had arrived, the Americans departed. The SAS team reached the extraction point at exactly 58 minutes into the operation. The helicopters that had been waiting in a holding pattern immediately began moving in. The team boarded the aircraft in a controlled manner, first the wounded, then the security elements, then the assault team. By the time the last soldier cleared the ground and the helicopters pulled away, exactly 1 hour and 2 minutes had elapsed from the start of the airstrikes. As the helicopters lifted away and turned toward Malaysian territory, the pilots looked back at the compound. Smoke was still rising from multiple locations. Fires were visible from kilometers away. The jungle around the training facility was in chaos, with enemy soldiers attempting to organize but finding themselves blocked by the continued presence of aircraft and the knowledge that the SAS were no longer there to be caught. The operation had been executed with a precision that was almost mathematical. Every minute accounted for, every objective achieved, every contingency planned for. The aftermath of Operation Trent was significant, not just for what it accomplished, but for what it demonstrated. The facility was successfully destroyed. The SAS intelligence team, examining the documents that had been retrieved from the compound, found detailed plans for insurgent operations, lists of trained personnel, supply routes, and communications networks. The intelligence windfall was substantial, but more important than any single piece of captured intelligence was the message that the operation sent. The Americans had been skeptical about what could be accomplished in 1 hour of air support. The SAS had taken that constraint and transformed it into an advantage. By planning so meticulously, by coordinating so precisely with American air assets, by using the air support not as the sole weapon, but as a force multiplier for their ground assault, they had demonstrated something that the American military was only beginning to understand, that small, highly trained forces operating with perfect coordination could accomplish disproportionate objectives in minimal time. The SAS had not just completed the operation. They had completed it well before their allocated time window closed, with casualties kept to a minimum and objectives exceeded rather than barely met. The implications for future operations were significant. The SAS began to develop even closer relationships with American air commanders in the region. American military planners began to request SAS participation in proposed operations more frequently. The SAS, in turn, became more sophisticated in their planning for air support integration, developing new methods for communication and coordination that other British forces began to adopt. The relationship between special forces and tactical air support, which had been somewhat ad hoc and improvised in earlier stages of the war in Southeast Asia, began to become more systematic and refined. But Operation Trent also demonstrated something about the SAS as an institution. The regiment had not accepted the constraints placed upon them as a limitation. Instead, they had accepted the constraints as a challenge, a problem to be solved through better planning, better coordination, better execution. This mindset, which had been instilled in the SAS since the regiment's founding during World War II, continued to define how the unit approached military operations. When told they had 1 hour of air support, they did not ask for more. They asked what they could accomplish in that 1 hour and then planned meticulously to accomplish it. The operation also underscored the SAS's commitment to self-reliance and efficiency. The regiment had developed over decades a culture where waste was viewed with something approaching moral disapproval. If resources were allocated, they would be used completely and to their maximum effect. If objectives could be achieved with fewer resources, the operation would be redesigned to require fewer resources. This was not simply about being thrifty, it was about being effective. Limited resources, properly deployed, were often more lethal than abundant resources poorly coordinated. In the years that followed Operation Trent, the British military establishment in London began to realize that they had something quite extraordinary in the SAS. The regiment was not simply a conventional unit operating in an unconventional manner. They were, in many respects, operating according to a different logic altogether. They thought in terms of effects rather than presence. They measured success not by how much firepower they brought to bear, but by how precisely they brought that firepower to bear. They viewed constraints not as limitations, but as design parameters, factors that forced them to think more clearly and plan more meticulously. The 1 hour that the Americans had allocated for air support during Operation Trent became, in retrospect, a defining moment in the evolution of special operations planning and execution. It marked a moment when a special operations force had been forced to prove, not just in theory but in practice, that elite training, meticulous planning, and precise coordination could accomplish more in a constrained time frame than conventional forces could accomplish with abundant resources. The Americans had set the constraint skeptically, perhaps even expecting that the SAS would fail or ask for an extension. Instead, the SAS had taken the constraint and transformed it into a demonstration of competence that reverberated through multiple military establishments and influenced how air support would be integrated into special operations for decades to come. The soldiers who participated in Operation Trent, as they moved on to subsequent operations and eventually to retirement, would carry with them the memory of that hour. They would tell stories about how carefully everything had been planned, how every minute had been accounted for, how the American pilots had held to their time window, not because it was easy, but because the SAS team had made it possible for them to do so. These stories became part of the institutional memory of the SAS, passed from one generation of soldiers to the next. They became part of the mythology that surrounded the regiment, the sense that the SAS was a unit that did more with less, that planned better than other units, that executed with a precision that was almost uncanny. The American military observers who had watched Operation Trent unfold, both from the air and from command posts in Kuala Lumpur, came away with a different respect for the British Special Operations capability. The initial skepticism about whether 1 hour of air support was sufficient gave way to a recognition that the SAS had not simply made do with limited resources. They had actually planned their operation around the specific constraints of 1 hour of air support, using those constraints to force themselves to be more focused and more effective. This lesson would influence American doctrine as well, contributing to the evolution of how the United States military thought about the integration of special operations forces with tactical air support. For the SAS itself, Operation Trent was important not as a rare example of having to operate under constraints, but as a particularly clear demonstration of how the regiment had turned constraints into competitive advantages. The men who had planned that operation had internalized a fundamental principle that the size of a force mattered far less than how that force was employed, that the duration of air support mattered far less than how that air support was coordinated, that the quantity of resources available mattered far less than how completely and precisely those resources were used. These principles would guide the SAS through subsequent operations and would become part of what made the regiment distinctive in the decades that followed. The broader geopolitical context of Operation Trent provided important background to why such a relatively small-scale military action was considered strategically significant. Southeast Asia in the early 1960s was viewed through the lens of Cold War confrontation, with American policymakers deeply concerned about communist expansion in the region. Indonesia's move toward communist elements in its government, the presence of communist-aligned movements in Malaya, and the broader uncertainty about whether the region would follow Western or Soviet-aligned political trajectories all contributed to American willingness to support British military operations in the region. The British, conversely, were concerned about protecting their remaining interests in the region and preventing communist movements from destabilizing neighboring countries. The threat of Indonesian-backed insurgency in Malaysian Borneo was viewed as a concrete manifestation of broader communist strategy, and countering this threat was understood as essential to containing communist expansion in Southeast Asia. Operation Trent, in this context, was one piece of a larger puzzle. The British military presence in Malaya and Borneo, combined with American support and intelligence, was meant to demonstrate that the Western alliance could compete effectively with communist-backed movements, and that support for communist insurgency would result in decisive military response. The message was directed not just at the insurgents themselves, but at the Indonesian government and at other regional actors who might be tempted to support insurgent movements. The precision and speed with which the SAS-led operation was planned and executed was itself part of the message. It demonstrated that Western military organizations could respond quickly, could operate effectively in difficult terrain, and could sustain minimal losses while inflicting maximum damage on enemy capabilities. The weapons and equipment that the SAS assault force carried into Operation Trent reflected the state of military technology in the early 1960s. The rifles and machine guns were conventional designs that had been in use for a decade or more. The explosives used for demolition were standard military demolition charges. The communications equipment was relatively primitive compared to later eras, relying on radios with limited range and reliability. Despite these limitations, the SAS conducted the operation with a precision that seemed disproportionate to the technology available. This suggested that the technological sophistication mattered less than the training, planning, and coordination that had been applied to the operation. A well-trained force, operating according to a clear plan that had been refined through rehearsal, could achieve results that would seem impossible with less well-trained forces, even if those forces had access to superior technology. The relationship between air power and ground operations that Operation Trent exemplified would become increasingly important to military operations throughout the latter half of the 20th century. The demonstration that a small ground force could accomplish significant objectives if provided with concentrated air support for even a brief period suggested possibilities for future military operations. American military planners, observing the Operation Trent precedent, began to consider how the rapid deployment and responsive use of air power could be integrated into special operations planning. The coordination mechanisms that had to be established to ensure that air support arrived precisely when needed, that friendly forces could be distinguished from enemy forces even in the chaos of battle, and that the airstrikes could be adjusted in response to developments on the ground, all became subjects of increasing military interest and study. The intelligence that had justified Operation Trent's planning had suggested that the target facility would be generating insurgent personnel at a rate that, if uninterrupted, would constitute a significant threat to Malaysian security. The documents captured during the operation provided confirmation of this assessment. The facility had been training multiple cohorts of fighters, with a pipeline that extended into Indonesia and a supply network that stretched across Kalimantan. The disruption of this facility, while not permanently eliminating the threat, did impose significant costs on insurgent organizations. New training facilities would need to be developed, relocated to areas even more remote from coalition observation, and operated with greater security measures to prevent similar attacks. These were not trivial undertakings, and the time required to rebuild this capacity represented a window of opportunity for counterinsurgent forces to exploit. As the SAS continued to evolve in the subsequent years and decades, the legacy of Operation Trent remained embedded in how the regiment approached planning and execution. When other units asked for more resources, the SAS asked whether they could accomplish the objective with existing resources, simply planned more carefully and executed more precisely. When commanders expressed doubt about whether an objective could be achieved in a given time frame, the SAS viewed this not as an impossible constraint, but as an interesting problem to be solved. When air support or other assets had to be limited, the SAS did not view this as a reduction in capability, but as a change in the problem statement that required a change in approach. The intelligence gathering that had preceded Operation Trent represented an intensive effort to understand not just the location of the target, but the likely daily patterns, the training schedules, the guard rotations, and the positions of any defenses that might be encountered. The SAS intelligence officers had interviewed Malaysian soldiers who operated in the region, who understood the terrain, who had observed the target facility over weeks or months. They had studied aerial reconnaissance photographs, analyzing the layout of buildings, the positions of visible weapons or equipment, and the patterns of activity that suggested how the training facility functioned. They had made mathematical calculations about the likely numbers of personnel in the facility at various times of day, based on the capacity of the buildings, the observation of group movements, and their understanding of typical military training schedules. This accumulation of intelligence was not conducted casually or as a side effort. It was conducted with the understanding that the operation would succeed or fail based on how complete and accurate this intelligence proved to be. The training cycle intelligence suggested that the target facility maintained a rotating schedule, with new groups of trainees arriving every 2 to 3 weeks, spending 3 to 5 weeks in the facility conducting military training and then departing. The SAS planners had determined that the best time to strike would be in the middle of a training cycle, when the facility would be at or near maximum capacity. This meant the operation would have maximum impact in terms of disrupting the enemy's training pipeline, but it also meant that the SAS would be assaulting a facility occupied by the maximum number of armed men, some of whom would be experienced soldiers, serving as instructors, and some of whom would be newer trainees who might be less effective in a firefight, but who would add to the total number of defenders. The SAS planning staff accepted this increased risk as the price of achieving maximum operational effect. The concept of operations itself was refined through dozens of planning meetings, tabletop exercises, and rehearsals. The SAS recognized that timing was everything. The American air support would need to arrive at precisely the moment the assault team was ready to move. If the air support arrived early, it would alert the enemy to the incoming assault and give defenders time to prepare. If it arrived late, the assault team would have already committed to the attack and would be vulnerable. The coordination required to ensure that helicopters, fighters, and ground forces all moved according to a synchronized timeline was extraordinarily complex. 1 minute of delay in any element could cascade through the entire operation and degrade the chances of success. The American air crews who would participate in the operation had to be briefed on the target, had to understand the location of friendly forces, and had to be ready to suppress enemy positions while avoiding striking the SAS assault team. This briefing had to provide enough detail that the air crews understood what was required, but not so much detail that the operation became so constrained that pilots could not respond to developing situations. The SAS understood that pilots needed some flexibility, needed to be able to respond to enemy positions that appeared during the operation, but that had not been anticipated during planning. The forward air controller who would accompany the assault team had to have both the technical knowledge to communicate with fighter aircraft and the tactical knowledge to understand what the assault team needed in terms of fire support. The 1 hour of air support that the United States had provided for Operation Trent had been intended as a compromise, enough to support the operation while still reserving American air assets for other commitments in the region. The Americans had not expected this constraint to become, in the hands of the SAS planning staff, the foundation for an operation that would become a textbook example of how to coordinate small ground forces with air support for maximum effect. The SAS had accepted the constraint, planned around it, executed within it, and in doing so had demonstrated something that military establishments around the world would spend decades trying to understand and replicate: the capacity to accomplish more with constraints than most units could accomplish with abundance, to turn limitations into advantages, to view the boundaries of what was possible not as walls, but as the edges of a challenge worth meeting head-on. The aftermath intelligence from Operation Trent revealed the extent of the target facility's importance to enemy operations. Documents captured during the assault described training pipelines for insurgent recruits, curricula focused on weapons handling and tactics, and supply routes that extended back into Indonesia proper. The facility had been operating for months without the coalition even knowing of its existence. The documents captured showed that the facility was training not just Indonesian soldiers, but also fighters from other Southeast Asian nations who had been recruited to support anti-Malaysia operations. The disruption of this facility, the destruction of its infrastructure, and the denial of its use as a training location for weeks or months represented a significant blow to the enemy's ability to sustain operations. The intelligence analysts who examined the captured documents reported that the facility was sufficiently important to the enemy's operational planning that they immediately began attempting to identify potential replacement locations where similar training could be conducted.